The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, watched her eldest son George carefully arrange his school books on the breakfast table. At 10 years old, he had developed a methodical approach to everything he did, much like his mother. What struck her most profoundly that particular morning wasn't his organizational skills, but the way the light caught his face as he concentrated on his mathematics homework. George had always been a beautiful child, but lately, something remarkable had been happening. The soft roundness of his early childhood was giving way to more defined features. And, with each passing month, the resemblance to his mother became increasingly undeniable. His jawline, though still delicate with youth, mirrored the elegant curve of Catherine's. His eyes, a striking blue-green that seemed to change with his moods, held the same warmth and intelligence that had captivated the world when Catherine first stepped into the royal spotlight. "Mummy, do you think this equation is correct?" George asked, looking up from his work. The gesture was so familiar it made Catherine's breath catch. It was the same tilt of the head, the same questioning expression she had worn countless times as a child when seeking approval from her own mother, Carol Middleton. "Let me see, darling," Catherine replied, moving closer to examine his work. As she leaned over his shoulder, she caught their reflection in the window glass. The similarity was startling. They had the same high cheekbones, the same gentle slope of the nose, and, most remarkably, the same expression of focused determination. Prince William had noticed it too. Just the previous evening, as they were reviewing photographs from George's recent school sports day, he had remarked with a mixture of wonder and amusement, "Good heavens, Catherine. It's like looking at a photograph of you at that age. Only George is wearing cricket whites instead of a dress." The observation had stayed with Catherine throughout the night. She had always hoped her children would inherit the best qualities from both sides of their family. But seeing her own features so clearly reflected in George felt like a gift she hadn't expected. It wasn't just his physical appearance that mirrored hers. His mannerisms, his way of processing emotions, even his particular brand of quiet confidence seemed to echo her own personality. George finished his breakfast and gathered his things for school. As he did so, Catherine noticed how he smoothed down his hair with the same motion she used, how he checked his reflection in the hallway mirror with the same critical but satisfied expression. These weren't learned behaviors. George had been too young to consciously copy her habits when these patterns first emerged. Instead, they seemed to be something deeper, an inheritance of gesture and grace that transcended mere genetics. "Are you ready for your presentation today?" Catherine asked as they walked toward the car. George had been preparing for weeks to speak to his class about renewable energy, a topic that had captured his imagination after a visit to a wind farm the previous summer. "I think so," George replied, his voice carrying that particular mix of excitement and nervousness that Catherine remembered so well from her own school days. "I practiced it dozens of times, but what if I forget something important?" Catherine knelt down to his level, straightening his school tie, a gesture her own mother had performed countless times. "Do you know what I do when I'm nervous about a speech or an engagement?" George shook his head, his eyes fixed on hers with complete attention. "I remember that being nervous means I care about doing well. It means the thing I'm about to do matters to me. That nervousness isn't something to fight against, it's something to use. It helps me focus and reminds me to be present in the moment." The way George absorbed this advice, nodding thoughtfully and then squaring his shoulders with newfound confidence, was so reminiscent of Catherine's own response to guidance that William, who had been watching from the doorway, smiled knowingly. During the drive to school, Catherine found herself studying George's profile as he gazed out the window. The strong line of his jaw was becoming more pronounced each month, and she could see hints of the handsome young man he would become. But more than his physical development, it was his emotional intelligence that reminded her most of herself. He had inherited her ability to read people, to sense when someone was troubled or when a situation required careful handling. Just last week, at a family gathering, George had noticed that his cousin was feeling left out of the game the other children were playing. Without any prompting, he had quietly reorganized the activity to include everyone, displaying the same instinctive diplomacy that had served Catherine so well in her royal role. The comparison wasn't lost on the royal household staff either. Margaret, the long-serving nanny who had cared for William and Harry in their youth, had mentioned to Catherine just days earlier how remarkable the resemblance had become. "It's not just the way he looks, Your Royal Highness," she had said with the familiarity of decades of service. "It's the way he carries himself, the way he thinks through problems. He has your grace under pressure." This observation had been proven correct during a recent public appearance when a sudden downpour had disrupted an outdoor event. While other children might have complained or become flustered, George had simply accepted the change in circumstances with a calm dignity that impressed even the most seasoned royal watchers. He had stood quietly beside his parents, his posture straight and his expression serene, occasionally offering a reassuring smile to younger children who seemed distressed by the weather. Catherine remembered being that child herself, the one who adapted to unexpected situations with quiet resilience, who found ways to make others feel comfortable even when she was uncertain herself. Seeing these traits emerge so naturally in George filled her with a complex mixture of pride and protective concern. She was proud that he had inherited her strengths, but she also understood the weight that would come with those gifts. As they arrived at school, George gathered his materials for his presentation. Catherine watched him check his notes one final time, saw him take a deep breath to center himself, another gesture that was purely hers, and felt a surge of maternal pride mixed with poignant recognition. "Have a wonderful day, my darling," she said, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I will, Mummy. Thank you for the advice about the nerves." As George walked toward the school entrance, his shoulders straight and his head held high, Catherine saw herself at that age, determined, thoughtful, and already showing signs of the poise that would serve her well in the years to come. The resemblance was no longer just physical. It was becoming a mirror of character, a reflection of the very qualities that had helped her navigate the complexities of royal life. That evening, when George returned home with glowing reports about his presentation, Catherine felt a deep sense of connection to her son that went beyond the typical mother-child bond. In watching him grow into himself, she was witnessing a beautiful echo of her own journey, and she knew that this striking resemblance, both physical and emotional, would only deepen as he continued to mature. The realization filled her with hope for his future and gratitude for the privilege of watching this remarkable young person develop into someone who carried the best of both his heritage and his own unique spirit. The autumn breeze swept across the grounds of Windsor Castle as the royal family prepared for their annual photographs. Catherine stood before her dressing mirror, adjusting her navy blue dress while her mind wandered to the conversation she had shared with Queen Elizabeth just weeks before her passing. The Queen had taken Catherine's hands in hers and spoken softly about the importance of preserving family legacy through the next generation. "Catherine, my dear," the Queen had said, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom of decades, "I see so much of you in young George, not just in his appearance, but in his spirit. He has your gift for making others feel at ease, your ability to listen before speaking. These are precious qualities for someone in his position." Now, months later, those words resonated even more deeply as Catherine watched George prepare for the formal photographs. At 10 years old, he moved through the preparations with a natural grace that astounded everyone around him. He straightened his younger siblings' clothing without being asked, offered a steadying hand to his grandmother when she navigated the castle steps, and maintained a patient composure even as the photographer adjusted lighting and repositioning the family multiple times. "George, could you stand just a bit closer to your mother?" the royal photographer requested. As George moved to comply, Catherine felt a jolt of recognition. The way he held himself, the slight tilt of his chin, the confident but not arrogant expression, it was like looking at a photograph of herself from decades past. The resemblance had evolved beyond mere physical similarity into something far more profound, a mirroring of character and presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. Prince William noticed it too, and later that evening, as they reviewed the preliminary photographs on the photographer's camera, he pointed out the uncanny similarities. In one particular shot, Catherine and George were captured mid-conversation, their heads tilted at identical angles, their expressions showing the same mix of warmth and attentiveness that had become Catherine's signature in public appearances. It's remarkable, isn't it? William mused, studying the images. He's developing your ability to be fully present with people. Look at how he's listening to Princess and in this photograph. Completely focused, genuinely interested. That's not something you can teach a child his age. It's an instinct he's inherited from you. The comparison went deeper than public demeanor. In private moments, Catherine had begun to notice how George processed emotions in the same way she did. When faced with disappointment, he would become quiet and thoughtful rather than immediately reactive. When celebrating achievements, his joy was genuine but controlled, showing the same emotional intelligence that had helped Catherine navigate the intense scrutiny of royal life. This emotional maturity had been particularly evident during a recent family crisis. When news broke about a distant relative's personal struggles making headlines in the press, George had approached Catherine with questions that demonstrated both his awareness of the situation and his concern for the family member involved. "Mummy, is Cousin Sarah going to be all right?" he had asked, his young face serious with worry. "What makes you ask about her, sweetheart?" Catherine had responded, curious about how much he understood. "I heard some of the grown-ups talking, and I could tell they were worried. Plus, she looked sad at the last family gathering, even when she was smiling. Sometimes people smile when they're hurting inside, don't they?" The perceptiveness of his observation had left Catherine momentarily speechless. At 10 years old, George was already demonstrating the kind of emotional intelligence that had taken her years to develop. His ability to read between the lines, to notice the subtle signs of distress that others might miss, was a gift that would serve him well in his future role, but also carried the burden of seeing more than a child his age should have to process. Catherine had taken the time to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms, helping George understand that sometimes adults face challenges that require support from family and professional help. What struck her most was how he listened, not just to her words, but to the emotions behind them. He asked thoughtful questions and offered genuine expressions of hope for their relative's recovery. "Could we send her some flowers?" he had suggested. Not because everyone would expect it, but because flowers might remind her that people care about her even when she's having difficult times. The gesture was so perfectly calibrated, thoughtful without being overwhelming, personal without being presumptuous, that Catherine realized George had inherited not just her empathy, but also her intuitive understanding of how to express care in ways that truly matter to the recipient. This emotional sophistication extended to his relationships with his siblings as well. Catherine often observed George navigating the complex dynamics of family life with a wisdom that seemed beyond his years. When Princess Charlotte became frustrated with a challenging piano piece she was learning, George didn't offer advice or try to fix the problem. Instead, he sat quietly beside her and shared a story about his own struggles with cricket techniques, helping her understand that difficulty was a normal part of learning something worthwhile. When Prince Louis had a meltdown during a family outing, overwhelmed by the noise and crowds, George had instinctively created a calm space around his youngest brother, speaking in soothing tones and offering distractions that matched Louis's interests rather than trying to force him to conform to the situation. These moments of leadership and compassion happened naturally, without prompting or praise-seeking. George seemed to possess an innate understanding that his position in the family came with responsibilities, but he fulfilled those responsibilities with genuine care rather than obligation. The resemblance to Catherine was perhaps most striking during formal engagements. When the family attended a charity event supporting children's mental health, George had interacted with the young people present with the same authentic interest that characterized Catherine's approach to her patronages. He asked questions that showed he had been listening to their stories, offered encouragement that felt sincere rather than scripted, and maintained appropriate boundaries while still being genuinely warm. One young girl at the event had been particularly shy, hanging back from the group while others eagerly shared their experiences. Catherine watched as George noticed the girl's hesitation and, rather than approaching her directly, positioned himself near enough that she could join the conversation if she felt comfortable, without any pressure. When she eventually did speak, George listened with complete attention and responded in a way that honored her courage in sharing. "That was very thoughtful of you," Catherine told him later as they traveled home from the event. "She reminded me of how I feel sometimes when there are lots of new people around." George replied, "Sometimes you want to join in, but you need time to feel safe first. I thought if I just stayed nearby, she might feel less alone." The insight was remarkable for its maturity and its accuracy. George had correctly identified the girl's emotional state and responded with exactly the kind of patient support that would be most helpful. It was the same instinctive emotional intelligence that had helped Catherine navigate countless similar situations throughout her royal career. As autumn deepened into winter, the resemblance between mother and son continued to evolve in unexpected ways. During a private family gathering, Catherine's mother, Carol, made an observation that stayed with Catherine for weeks afterward. "Watching George is like seeing you at that age all over again," Carol had said while they prepared dinner together. "Not just the way he looks, though that's remarkable enough. It's his approach to people, his thoughtfulness, the way he notices things others might miss. He has your gift for making people feel valued and understood." The comment prompted Catherine to reflect on her own childhood and the experiences that had shaped her emotional intelligence. She remembered being the child who noticed when classmates were struggling, who instinctively knew how to defuse tense situations, who could sense the unspoken emotions in any room. Seeing these same qualities emerge in George felt like watching a beautiful inheritance unfold, not just of genetics, but of character traits that would serve him well throughout his life. That evening, as she tucked George into bed, Catherine found herself looking into eyes that mirrored her own and seeing not just physical resemblance, but a reflection of values, sensitivity, and strength that filled her heart with both pride and protective love. The striking resemblance they shared was becoming a bridge between past and future, a continuation of the best qualities from one generation to the next. The winter months brought new revelations about the deepening connection between Catherine and George. During the Christmas holidays at Sandringham, extended family members who hadn't seen George for several months were struck by how dramatically his resemblance to his mother had intensified. But it was his grandfather, King Charles, who made the most profound observation during a quiet moment by the fireplace. "Catherine, my dear, watching George navigate this week's festivities has been quite remarkable," the king said, his voice filled with paternal warmth. "He has inherited your remarkable ability to honor tradition while remaining completely authentic. It's a rare gift, and one that will serve him well in the years ahead." The Christmas gathering had indeed showcased George's evolving character in ways that mirrored his mother's approach to royal life. When younger cousins became overwhelmed by the formal dinner protocols, George had quietly demonstrated proper etiquette without making them feel embarrassed about their mistakes. When elderly relatives shared long stories about family history, he listened with genuine interest rather than the polite but distant attention that might be expected from a 10-year-old. Most notably, when the family gathered for the traditional Christmas morning church service, George had shown the same natural reverence and respectful participation that characterized Catherine's approach to royal duties. He sang hymns with quiet enthusiasm, bowed his head appropriately during prayers, and maintained perfect posture throughout the service without appearing stiff or uncomfortable. He understands the significance of these moments, Catherine observed to William as they watched their son greet congregation members after the service. Not because someone told him to, but because he feels it himself. The resemblance extended beyond formal occasions into the more intimate moments of family life. During a snowy afternoon at Anmer Hall, Catherine discovered George in the library, not reading for homework or entertainment, but carefully studying photographs from her childhood that her mother had brought to share. He was comparing images of Catherine at various ages with recent photographs of himself, his expression thoughtful rather than vain. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Catherine asked, settling beside him on the window seat. "I was wondering if looking like you means I think like you too," George replied with the kind of philosophical directness that never failed to surprise her. "People always say we're similar, but I want to understand what that really means." The question launched a conversation that would become one of Catherine's most treasured memories. George wanted to understand not just the physical similarities everyone commented on, but whether he had inherited her ways of seeing the world, her approaches to solving problems, her methods of connecting with others. "Tell me about a time when you had to make a difficult decision," George requested, settling more comfortably against the cushions. Catherine shared the story of her early days as a royal, when she had struggled with how to maintain her authentic self while fulfilling the expectations of her new role. She explained how she had learned to find strength in vulnerability, to see challenging situations as opportunities for growth rather than threats to be avoided. "I think I do that too," George said thoughtfully. "Like when I was nervous about the school debate competition last month. Instead of trying to stop being nervous, I decided the nervousness meant I cared about doing well. It helped me prepare better." The parallel was exact, and it demonstrated that George wasn't simply mimicking his mother's behaviors, but had genuinely inherited her cognitive patterns and emotional processing methods. This realization filled Catherine with both wonder and a sense of profound responsibility. As winter gave way to spring, the resemblance became a subject of public fascination. During the family's first major engagement of the new year, a visit to a children's hospital, photographers captured dozens of images that highlighted the uncanny similarities between mother and son. But it was the candid moments, not the posed photographs, that truly showcased their mirrored personalities. When they visited the pediatric ward, Catherine watched George interact with a young patient who was feeling scared about an upcoming surgery. George didn't offer empty reassurances or try to distract the child with jokes. Instead, he sat quietly and listened to the boy's concerns, asked thoughtful questions about what worried him most, and then shared his own experience of feeling nervous before important moments. "I get scared sometimes, too," George said simply. "My mommy taught me that being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. Sometimes the bravest thing is doing something important even when you're scared." The conversation was conducted with such natural empathy and age-appropriate wisdom that even the experienced medical staff were impressed. Later, a nurse approached Catherine privately to say, "Your son has a remarkable gift for making people feel heard and understood. That little boy has been anxious for days, and George helped him feel calmer in just a few minutes." The incident highlighted how George had absorbed not just Catherine's emotional intelligence, but also her approach to using personal vulnerability as a way to connect with others authentically. It was a sophisticated social skill that many adults never master, yet George seemed to access it instinctively. This emotional sophistication was tested more severely during a family crisis in early spring. Catherine's close friend suffered a miscarriage, and Catherine found herself struggling with how to support her friend while managing her own emotional response to the tragedy. George, with his heightened sensitivity to the emotions of those around him, noticed his mother's distress even though she tried to hide it. "Mummy, you seem sad today," he observed during breakfast one morning. "Is there something I can help with?" Catherine was faced with a delicate balance, wanting to protect George's childhood innocence while recognizing that his emotional intelligence meant he would sense something was wrong regardless of what she said. She chose to trust his maturity and explained in gentle terms that a dear friend was going through a very difficult time after losing a baby she had been expecting. George listened with the same focused attention he always gave to serious conversations. When Catherine finished explaining, he was quiet for several minutes, processing the information with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Could we make something to help her feel less alone?" he finally asked. "Not something to make her feel better, because I don't think anything could do that right now. But something to show her that we're thinking about her and that we care. The suggestion led to George spending hours creating a carefully crafted card that expressed sympathy without trying to minimize his friend's pain. His message was simple: "I'm sorry you're hurting. I'm thinking about you." Below his words, he drew a small garden with flowers in various stages of growth, explaining to Catherine that he wanted to show that beautiful things could grow again even after difficult times. The gesture was perfect in its restraint and thoughtfulness, exactly the kind of response Catherine herself would have crafted. When her friend received the card, she called Catherine in tears, saying that George's message had provided more comfort than dozens of well-meaning, but more elaborate expressions of sympathy. "He somehow knew exactly what I needed to hear," her friend said. "Not that everything happens for a reason or that I'll feel better soon, but simply that I'm not alone in this." How does a 10-year-old understand that? The answer, Catherine realized, was that George had inherited her ability to prioritize the recipient's needs over her own desire to help or fix things. He understood intuitively that sometimes the most helpful response is simply bearing witness to someone's pain without trying to change or diminish it. As spring progressed into early summer, these moments of emotional wisdom became more frequent and more sophisticated. George began showing signs of the same diplomatic skills that had served Catherine so well in her royal role. When family disagreements arose, he had an uncanny ability to find common ground without taking sides or diminishing anyone's feelings. During a particularly tense discussion about summer holiday plans, when different family members wanted to pursue conflicting activities, George suggested a solution that incorporated elements of everyone's preferences while creating new possibilities that no one had previously considered. His approach was collaborative rather than competitive, and he presented his ideas in a way that allowed everyone to feel heard and valued. "He has your gift for making everyone feel like winners," William observed later. "That's going to be invaluable in his future role." But perhaps the most touching demonstration of George's inherited wisdom came during a quiet evening at home. Catherine had been dealing with intense public criticism regarding a recent royal engagement, and despite her efforts to hide her hurt, George sensed her emotional state. "Mummy," he said, approaching her as she sat in the garden, "I know people said mean things about you this week. I wanted you to know that I think you're perfect exactly the way you are, and I'm proud to look like you and think like you." The simple declaration, offered without prompting or expectation of response, encapsulated everything Catherine treasured about their growing resemblance. It wasn't just about shared features or inherited mannerisms. It was about a connection of hearts and minds that created understanding and support across the generations. Looking at George in that moment, Catherine saw not just her own reflection, but a glimpse of the remarkable man he was becoming, someone who would carry the best of their shared traits into a future filled with purpose and possibility. Summer arrived with its promise of longer days and treasured family time, but it also brought new challenges that would test the remarkable bond between Catherine and George in unexpected ways. As the school year ended and public engagements increased, the striking resemblance between mother and son became not just a family observation, but a source of intense public fascination that would reshape their relationship in profound ways. The transformation became most apparent during the annual Trooping the Color ceremony. As the royal family appeared on the Buckingham Palace balcony, photographers captured what would become some of the most widely circulated images of the year. George, now 11, and showing even more pronounced similarities to his mother, stood beside Catherine with identical posture, matching expressions of dignified enjoyment, and an uncanny synchronization of gesture that seemed almost choreographed but was entirely natural. They moved like dancers who have rehearsed together for years, one seasoned royal photographer commented to his colleague. But it's not learned behavior. It's something deeper, an inherited grace that's becoming more apparent with each public appearance. The media attention that followed was unlike anything the family had experienced before. Headlines focused not just on George's physical resemblance to Catherine, but on what royal commentators began calling his inherited wisdom, the emotional intelligence and natural diplomacy that mirrored his mother's most celebrated qualities. Catherine found herself navigating uncharted territory as she tried to protect George's privacy while acknowledging the public's genuine fascination with their connection. The challenge was compounded by George's own growing awareness of the attention and his surprisingly mature response to it. "Mummy, I understand why people are interested in how we're similar," George said during a private conversation in Catherine's study. "But I want to make sure I'm becoming myself, not just a copy of you. Is that possible when we're so much alike?" The question revealed a level of self-reflection that both impressed and concerned Catherine. At 11, George was grappling with issues of identity and authenticity that many people don't confront until much later in life. His awareness of their resemblance had evolved from simple curiosity to a more complex understanding of both its gifts and its potential limitations. "What makes you worry about that?" Catherine asked, setting aside her correspondence to give him her complete attention. "Well, last week at school, when I disagreed with something in our history discussion, one of my classmates said I was just repeating what you would think. It made me wonder if my opinions are really mine or if I'm just thinking your thoughts because we're so similar." The concern was surprisingly sophisticated and demonstrated George's developing capacity for philosophical thinking. Catherine realized that their resemblance, while beautiful and meaningful, was creating unique pressures for her son that required careful navigation. "Let me ask you something," Catherine said thoughtfully. "When you disagreed with your classmate's interpretation of history, what was your disagreement based on?" George explained his reasoning, drawing connections between historical events and contemporary issues that showed original thinking and careful analysis. His perspective was informed, but distinctly his own, incorporating knowledge from sources Catherine hadn't shared with him and applying logical frameworks that reflected his own developing worldview. "Does that sound like you're just copying my thoughts?" Catherine asked when he finished. "No," George admitted with a small smile. "It sounds like me thinking for myself, but using some of the thinking skills you've taught me." The conversation marked a turning point in how they both understood their resemblance. Rather than seeing it as a limitation on George's individual development, they began to frame it as a foundation that could support his unique growth. The similarities between them weren't obstacles to his becoming his own person. They were tools he could use while developing his individual identity. This newfound perspective was tested during the family's summer vacation at Balmoral. Extended time together revealed new dimensions of both their similarities and their differences. While George continued to mirror Catherine's emotional intelligence and social grace, he also began to assert preferences and interests that were distinctly his own. He showed a passion for environmental science that went beyond Catherine's own interests, spending hours observing wildlife and taking detailed notes about ecosystem interactions. His approach to this hobby reflected her methodical nature and attention to detail, but the specific focus was entirely his own choice. "He's using the thinking patterns you've given him to explore territory that's completely his own," William observed as they watched George conduct what he called field research in the castle gardens. "It's the perfect balance, inherited wisdom applied to individual passion." The summer also brought opportunities for George to demonstrate his growing leadership skills in situations where direct comparison to Catherine wasn't possible. When younger cousins visited Balmoral, George naturally assumed a mentoring role that showcased his inherited empathy while revealing his own unique approaches to guidance and support. Unlike Catherine, who tended to lead through gentle suggestion and emotional support, George showed a more direct but equally effective style. He offered clear explanations when cousins were confused, set reasonable boundaries when activities became too chaotic, and created structured activities that played to each child's strengths. "He has your compassion and wisdom," Catherine's sister Pippa observed, "but he's applying them in ways that are distinctly masculine and uniquely his own. It's fascinating to watch." The observation highlighted how George was successfully integrating their shared traits with his own developing personality. The resemblance that had once seemed like simple mimicry was evolving into something more sophisticated, a harmonious blend of inherited gifts and individual expression. This evolution became even more apparent during the family's participation in a charity event supporting young people dealing with anxiety and depression. Catherine had expected George to mirror her approach to such engagements, but instead watched him develop his own methods of connection and support. Where Catherine typically created intimate conversation opportunities that allowed young people to share their experiences privately, George organized group activities that encouraged peer support and collective problem-solving. His approach was more active and collaborative, but equally effective in creating meaningful connections. "Your son has remarkable instincts for what different people need," a youth counselor told Catherine after the event. "He seems to understand that some young people heal through sharing stories, while others need to feel useful and capable." He created space for both approaches. The feedback revealed that George wasn't simply inheriting Catherine's emotional intelligence. He was developing his own sophisticated understanding of human nature that built upon her foundation while incorporating his unique perspectives and instincts. As autumn approached and the family prepared to return to their regular routines, Catherine reflected on how much their relationship had deepened and evolved over the past year. The striking resemblance that had initially seemed like a simple genetic coincidence had become the foundation for a profound connection that honored both their similarities and their differences. During their last evening at Balmoral, George approached Catherine with a request that demonstrated his growing maturity and self-awareness. "Mummy, I've been thinking about something all summer. Would you be willing to be my partner in some of the charity work you do? Not because I want to copy you, but because I think I might have something valuable to contribute, and I'd like to learn more about using our position to help people." The request was perfectly calibrated, showing respect for Catherine's expertise while asserting his own desire to contribute meaningfully. It demonstrated that he understood their resemblance as a starting point for collaboration rather than a limitation on his individual growth. "I would be honored to work with you," Catherine replied, recognizing that George was offering something precious, the opportunity to build upon their shared traits while supporting his development as an individual leader. As they planned their future collaborations, Catherine realized that the striking resemblance between them had become something far more valuable than mere physical similarity. It had evolved into a bridge between generations, a foundation for shared purpose, and a launching point for George's own unique contributions to the world. Looking at her son as he outlined his ideas for their partnership, Catherine saw not just her own reflection, but a glimpse of the remarkable leader he was becoming, someone who would carry forward the best of their shared traits while bringing his own vision, compassion, and wisdom to the challenges ahead. The resemblance that had captured public attention was revealing itself to be just the beginning of a much more profound and meaningful connection that would shape both their futures in beautiful and unexpected ways. In the quiet moments before bedtime, as George kissed her goodnight, Catherine felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the privilege of watching this extraordinary young person develop into himself. Their striking resemblance had become a gift that kept revealing new layers of meaning, connection, and possibility, promising a future filled with shared purpose and individual growth that would honor both their similarities and their unique contributions to the world.